Good. So good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. In May, the Israeli High Court of Justice has rejected a number of appeals against eviction orders that have been issued to Palestinian inhabitants of the area of Masafer Yatta. And since then, forced evictions are not only imminent to more than 1,000 people, some people have already been evicted and some houses destroyed as far as. My name is Magri. I'm the coordinator of the Forum for Human Rights in Israel and Palestine. We are hosting this webinar, and we are a group of 12 Switzerland-based NGOs who aim to foster a human rights-based approach to the Middle East conflict. And we do so on the one hand by lobbying activities. So we try to encourage Swiss parliamentarians and also members of the public administration and other public figures to engage for human rights in Palestine and Israel. And we also do so by engaging in awareness raising activities for a broad, mainly Swiss public, such as this webinar. In the recent years, the interest in the situation in Israel-Palestine and in the ongoing occupation has rather declined in Switzerland. And this even though the grievances on the ground have worsened since. To give you an example, events of great importance, such as the mentioned court verdict that we're going to discuss today, have widely been ignored by a majority of Swiss media. And it is therefore of particular concern for us as Forum for Human Rights in Israel and Palestine to regain the attention of Swiss media and of course also of Swiss abroad Swiss public, because only like this we think we can also increase the pressure on politicians at home and also abroad to demand the end of the occupation. And we believe that a particularly good mean to regain attention is to put into contact directly affected people from Israel and Palestine with the Swiss public. And this is why we're very pleased to introduce to you already Avner Gvaryahu, who is the executive director of the Israeli veteran organization Breaking the Silence. And in a minute, we will be joined by Basil Al Adra, who is a renowned activist and journalist from Masafer Yatta itself. Thank you, Avner, and later Basil, for being with us today. And many thanks also to Anita Streule from Amnesty International, who has co-organized this webinar with us and who is going to moderate the discussion. So, Anita, I'm pleased to hand you over the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Roman, and thank you, Avner. It's only 1:03, and yes, people have joined in. Happy to have you all who are listening, and happy to have Avner here with us. As Roman said, Basil Al Adra will be joining in a minute. Well, yes, I think just as Roman said, people in Masafer Yatta, the villages in Masafer Yatta hosting more than 1,000 Palestinians are at threat of forced evictions. It's families that are making a living, working as shepherds and farmers, living a life, a simple life in the South Hebron Hills. That's the hills going from Hebron, Al-Khalil down to the Negev Nakab, where they try to make a living and to survive. And after more than 20 years of a legal struggle, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled last May that the Palestinians living in Masafer Yatta had to leave their villages. They had to leave their grazing fields for their sheep and their land, because the court decided that this land belonged to the Israeli army, who is planning to use it as a military training area like the so-called firing zone 918. So in other words, after more than 20 years of legal struggle, the Supreme Court ruled that Palestinians living in Masafer Yatta can be forcibly evicted and that their homes can be destroyed. Basil, who is going to join us, I think is really busy in documenting and opposing the things that are happening at the moment on the ground. I hope he can join in soon. We have here already a Avner Gvaryahu from Breaking the Silence. And well, Masafer Yatta, let me start with you, is in the occupied West Bank since 1967. And since the Oslo Accords, it's part of Area C. So it'd be interesting from you to know, like, what does that mean in reality for the people on the ground? And well, on the ground is as well the Israeli army, and that's maybe the perspective you best can bring in, like, what does it mean as well for the soldiers serving?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Roman and Anita, and I see Basil is just joining us now. Hey, Basil, great to see you.
Very good to see you.
So
Good to see you
we're just starting. So maybe I'll just say you know, a quick word about sort of our perspective, and then hand it to Basil. So yeah, I've been with Breaking the Silence for over 10 years. We're a group of former soldiers who served in the occupied territories, and we really take it upon ourselves to share our experiences in order to better understand the occupation, challenge it, and eventually to bring an end to it. We're not trying to better the occupation or make sure soldiers are more moral. We want soldiers to stop occupying the Palestinians. I served in different places across the West Bank, mostly around Nablus and Jenin, but I also spent some time in the South Hebron Hills. And part of what I saw and did and took part of is also in those areas is what motivated me to break my silence. I think, Anita, you talked about what's happening on the ground. I think that it is very clear, you know, definitely to us that, you know, that the communities that are most affected by this ongoing occupation are the Palestinian communities. And I think that part of what we try to shed the light on is a system that isn't a random system, but an orchestrated attempt to minimize the presence of Palestinian communities in these areas through a bunch of different tools and methods. And in that sense, we talk about this triangle of control, that the government's policy, the military presence and action, and the lack of law enforcement or settler violence basically make the lives of Palestinians unbearable in some places, and definitely extremely difficult. And I think one of the latest things that we've been seeing in the South Hebron Hills, or one of the latest examples of this, is really what's unfolding in the South Hebron Hills, as you mentioned, an area that really since the Oslo Accords has been considered Area C, but even before that, already in the 80s, an entire area was declared by Ariel Sharon as a firing zone, even though in this area, according to aerial footage, historians, and the experiences and reality of the Palestinian communities there, people have been living there much before the area was declared a firing zone, much before the area was occupied in '67. And there's a long rooted history of communities in the area. So maybe I'll pass it on to Basil. Anita, is that what that makes sense? Maybe pass it on to Basil to share a bit of your life story and what you're dealing with literally right now.
So hi everyone, thank you again. So my name is Basil Al Adra from the village of Tuani in the South Hebron Hills in Masafer Yatta. I am a journalist and activist on the ground. I write for 972 magazine articles, specifically about the area, but also other things going on in the West Bank. As Avner were telling about the firing zone and how they declare that the Israeli occupation army declared 12 communities of Masafer Yatta as a firing zone. Now, at this moment, there are Israeli soldiers, tanks, and bulldozers, and army shooting as kind of military exercise that's going on in the area. They announced that it will be for 1 month. Started last week, and now and the other 2 weeks that coming, from Monday to Wednesday, they go with tanks and bulldozers, a lot of soldiers, drones, helicopter as well, between the communities. There are also presence of soldiers as checkpoints, like they set up tents on the way, on the roads of the people, and they sit there checking everyone going and coming into the communities. Before 2 days, they confiscated a car for the lawyers who support the people in the communities and defending them, under the pretext that the car were moving in firing zone area. And this is what they do, how they limit the movement of the people by confiscating their cars, as for them, civilian cars can't move in military area. As well, during the trainings, no shepherds allowed to move out to graze. No one can move outside of their homes. The army will prevent that, even though the people themselves are afraid, because also the army bombing things on the ground, as well the tanks and the soldier, the whole scene is really scary for people to be moving out of their community, so they have to stay at their homes. Imagine if when the people has urgent thing going on, they are not and if they're not allowed to go or to move, and if they need ambulance or something, it will take hours to reach them, because checkpoints, army training, roads are already bulldozed by army bulldozers. So this sanction and this thing that they're doing at the training, it's added to different stuff that the army have been doing since decades against the people here in Masafer Yatta, in order to make them leave this land and go to the big Palestinian cities in Area A. They just want to colonize this area. They just want to remove us from here to make more rooms for settlers, for the settlements to expand
So I think it has been interrupted on my end, with you as well. Basil, I don't know if you can hear us. Your voice is interrupted. So I will take it from here. I think for me, it's really an honor to have you here, Basil, or to have had you here. I hope he will be back soon, because that the person takes time to speak to us, right? When the villages are concrete under threat, and there is shooting, and there are tanks, and the military is training basically on the civilian population. For me, this is very striking, but you would reckon that the Israeli army has other places to train, right? They don't really need the training sites amongst the villages where people and civilians are living. Welcome back, Basil. So what Basil just described of this military exercise that is adding another layer to make the life of the people in Masafer Yatta unbearable, and to make them basically leave the place. Avner, I mean, how is it? Why would the army do that? Why wouldn't they train somewhere else? And with what goal do they do that on one end? And then is as well, like, how is it as a soldier as a commander, as a part of the Israeli army that is occupying the land, to be there and to do these things? Like, would that make you think, in fact?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think one that I'm still trying to figure out now, over a decade into this work, I think especially because it's not sort of it's not a far away, distant conflict, right? It's a military dictatorship that's, you know, half an hour from where I live in Tel Aviv. It's you know, it's ongoing every day, and especially, you know, the few Israelis that keep going into the territories as activists, I think the dissonance is always striking. But I mean, I think that one place to start to explain sort of the rationale of what's happening in the firing zone is we have to remember that when we're talking about the settlement project or the settlement enterprise, we're not talking about a project that has just, you know, that people just built wherever they could access land, right? I mean, it's not a sort of you know, only a real estate project for the Israeli settlers or for the Israeli government, right? But it's rather settlements were always seen as a tool of control and as a means to define borders, right? So you see a very clear example of this in, for example, the Jordan Valley. A longtime Israeli general, later on a minister named Yigal Allon from the Labor Party, put forward a plan called the Allon Plan, named after him. And there's actually a road named after him today in the Jordan Valley called the Allon Road. The settlements in the Jordan Valley are basically built along this road. The Jordan Valley is a pretty large, long area, and the idea of the roads and the settlements were to separate the Palestinian communities living in the occupied territories from Jordan, right? And preventing a very similar kind of process, also part of the Allon Plan, takes place in the South Hebron Hills, this area that we're talking about. And we won't get into all the details, but Allon basically wants to carve out an area and to create semi-autonomy for Palestinians, something that never happened. But as we know, plans put on the table in the occupied territories tend to stick. So even though his plan was never officially accepted, and the concept of an autonomy that might maybe be connected to Jordan goes off the table pretty early on, but the concept of where settlements will be built is based along the Allon Plan. And there's a road called Road 317, which is a very significant road, that along that road, we start seeing settlements being popped up in the 80s. So, Tina, when you ask about this, why are soldiers training there? When we go back to the 80s, not only are there settlement building, there's also other ways or attempts to take control of land. And another very important figure that was very relevant to the settlement project, sort of the next generation of generals, is Ariel Sharon. And Ariel Sharon already in the 80s declares this very big piece of area as a firing zone. There's firing zones all across the West Bank. Big percentage of the occupied territories are declared firing zones. And Sharon says in a closed meeting that was revealed around some of these court hearings before the Supreme Court made a decision, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, basically said something along the lines as we need there to be this firing zone to prevent the Palestinian communities from being there, right? So it's not that the Palestinian communities were there and, sadly, there's a conflict because we both need the same areas. But when they were thinking, where can we declare a firing zone? It was where there were Palestinian communities living, and we really see in a 22-year battle, for almost 20 years there was no training there, but starting in the 2000s we started seeing soldiers trained there, and this court case has been going on. Even if we buy into the falsehood of the position of the state, that Palestinians only started living there after it was declared a firing zone, which is not true. There's evidence and so on, but even if you go with them, we're talking about the community that has been living in the same area, but according to their accounts, for at least 42 years. And there are other areas where soldiers can train. It just means they have to be bused to various places, which could cost a little bit of money. Not that we're in a shortage of that when it comes to the Israeli military. But part of what we see, and we see this from our testifiers, is that soldiers are systematically training in these communities, and are part, even if they don't know it, part of this concept that generals talked about and Israeli generals talked about the concept of Gaza, but is very relevant here, this concept of mowing the lawn and basically preventing Palestinians from living their lives in their ancestral land for the sake of training, but it's really in the sake of preventing Palestinians to expand and live in these areas in the South Hebron Hills and generally in Area C.
Basil, thank you again for being here, despite all the things that are happening right now in Masafer Yatta. It's really an honor to have you, and I'm very happy and pleased that you have taken the time. So what Avner now just said is from the Israeli soldiers' perspective, or kind of an perspective of a policy, but at the same time, your family, your neighbors, your friends and foes, but like the Palestinian communities living there under these circumstances, and in a way, by living there, resisting these policies as well. Like, what does it mean to live in the South Hebron Hills? How does it look like everyday life? How does it impact these policies? How do they impact your daily
life? Again, thank you, and sorry for the connection. It's keep cutting some time. Being living in Masafer Yatta and the South Hebron Hills and this situation, for me, it's really because I born and raised and grew up and became activist and a journalist in the same situation, the same fear. The stuff that I was watching and witnessing and being scared of it. For example, the soldiers beating brutally my father and arresting him while he's with the sheep. It was hurting me as a kid and being afraid of watching it and thinking about it. And now it's happening to me. The same thing has happened to my father. I mean, for me personally, really tired to keep living this life, and every day and every night being worried from soldiers come to raid the house, being worried Shepherd will call me, there is settlers attacking or chasing him, being worried every morning, wake up that someone will call me, there are bulldozers coming to demolition in the areas, have to chase them and to go look wherever they go and just document what they are doing, and watching mothers and children crying and people cursing and shouting at the soldiers who does not care about that, just taking the people out of their home and make the bulldozer demolish and whip out their home. these scenes and this experience and it's our daily life is really exhausted. It's exhausting us from wake up every morning and keep like living the same life, thinking about our steadfastness and resistance when we don't have really much power in front of this monster that have so much support from abroad. It's a state that has army, settlers, whatever they want in order to gain their goals by evacuating us and making our life hard. So on the other hand, we're trying to use our tiny power to react and to resist by document them, writing about what's happening, talking to the international community, willing to have serious pressure by the international community on the Israeli authorities to stop the occupation and to stop the apartheid. And in Masafer Yatta specifically now, after we lost this legal battle that the occupation court has decided that this 8 communities can be transferred and by force for the army to do the trainings. It's from the highest judicial system in Israel. This decision has come out, so we don't have much hope to go deal with it legally in Israel. So we're the only hope for us to save these communities and to leave the people living their life. It's the international community pressure, and should be very simple, very basic thing to do, because the international community should do more against the occupation and the apartheid. First, to stop hypocrisy and to really make Israel handle sanction of what they are committing. After there's reporting from Amnesty, from the United Nations, from all these human rights organizations that they are funding and supported by the European Union, by the United States. But when it comes to write reports about Israel, there's no really serious action taken by these countries to really make pressure on the Israeli authorities to stop their apartheid against us. And that's what we are willing always to happen. That's what we are wishing. And it's the only way for me, I believe, that the occupation will end, the apartheid will end. It's when the international community really taking serious steps against it.
Anita, just before you go ahead, thank you very much, Basil. To the audience, I've seen that one person raised hand a while ago. Another person writes in the chat function. So I'd like to invite you, if you have questions to Avner or Basil, please use the question and answer tool on the bottom of your screen, or in German F&A, and then your questions will be integrated in the discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Roman. Basil was mentioning the support or the pressure that is needed from the international community, and that's what we are trying to to bring about, at least in Switzerland. At the same time, Avner and Breaking the Silence, for example, you're very implicated in the protests as well, and in the support of the community in Masafer Yatta and co-resisting. What do you see that is possible as well to bring up from inside Israel, and how is it possible to reach the Israeli society with critical calls?
I think that, like other struggles, both international, outside of Israel-Palestine and in Israel-Palestine, we see where there is a cocktail approach, right? If we see how a multifaceted approach can create some sort of, in some places, change, in other places, prevent catastrophes, right? I mean, we saw this, there's an example in the South Hebron Hills, not in the firings over the community by the name of Susia, that just 10 years ago was up for demolition. The community Basil is from, as he mentioned, Tawani. We're talking about a brave struggle of the community that really managed to prevent mass demolitions there. And so I think first and foremost, I am honored to, and learn every day from the amazing activists in the South Hebron Hills. And not only are they amazing activists, but they're also very welcoming, right? Which isn't trivial. I mean, even the fact that Basil is, sitting here virtually, but speaking together with me isn't trivial. He also will welcome me and us in his house, which is, I think, also not trivial. I mean, we're Israelis, we're a group of former Israeli soldiers, but the community has been very welcoming to Israeli activists and international activists. And I think that is part of what we have to do. It's show up, it's co-resist, to make sure that we can, once we're there, once there's an opportunity to learn, echo it, in our circles, in our surroundings, bring more people to the field. And I think that there are specific places where that could be, can affect the conversation. But we also have to be honest. The Israeli government, and we saw this in the last year, we're just, starting, a fourth election, and we're going to probably have a fifth one. And this cycle, maybe it's the fifth, I don't remember already, another cycle of elections. We had a government for a year and a few months that had in it center-left and left-leaning ministers and members of parliament. And some of them were powerless, some of them wanted to do stuff and were powerless, and others didn't put this issue on the top of their agenda, right? A very, very striking example is the Minister of Interior Affairs from the Labour Party, a guy named Omer Bar-Lev. He was in charge of law enforcement over settlers. He's in charge of the police. And not only did we not see a change in police policy towards settler violence, but we've seen, listen to these numbers, I mean, I was even surprised. 2021 was one of the top years in terms of settler violence towards Palestinians in the history of the occupation. In the first 6 months of 2022, we surpassed 2021. These are according to the numbers of the military. So it's probably more or double. And I think that this is a striking reminder that in the end, for many different reasons, the Israeli government is not going to bring an end to the occupation tomorrow. And therefore, we need to think as activists how we are, one, continuing the pressure here, bringing more folks to the ground, but also how we're thinking together with the international community on how to make this an issue for the current Israeli government, as long as it will last, probably till November, and to any future government, because the elections that we're going to in a couple of months, I'm going to go vote for the future of Basil. I have the ability to decide who and how the life of millions of people who have no right to vote are gonna look like, right? So that is sort of the epitome of inequality. That's really, why the framework of apartheid, I think, is very relevant, talking about what's happening in the occupied territory. So I think that's how we have to, that's the prism we have to look to, co-resist and make sure that we're using the pressure points to make sure we're learning from what happened in other places where there was successes, and make sure that we're copying them to the firing zone 918 in Masafer Yatta.
Thank you very much. I think for me, there is really one aspect both of you mentioned before, that it's not just the Israeli army and the formal structures kind of putting pressure on the people and the land in the occupied West Bank, but in fact it's as well the settlers. Like the communities in Masafer Yatta are exposed to, they're in a way living cheek by cheek with the settlers, and then while the Palestinian villages have very limited resources, the settlers do have these resources, and then there is the tax of the settlers. Basil, would you mind telling a bit more about the role of the settlers from your perspective?
Yes, I mean, first of all, the settlers' presence is violent itself. This started from the 80s in this area by taking our land and building the settlements and making them presence on our land. This is violence. And that started since the 80s. That was the beginning until today. It's continuing. By every day, we are watching the settlers like expanding on our land, and the state for sure make all support for them to build the infrastructure on our land, while we are prevented to have this infrastructure, and if we do, they come and demolish it. So all like the things that going on against us by demolishing our homes, the training, all these things that we're explaining, it's simply to make these settlers have more rooms and expand more and more and more on our land. And one of these policies the settlers using for making this machine like and their goal like more achievable, it's the settlers attacks and the settlers violence. And there is like the settlers like daily harassments by a group of settlers. See, for example, a shepherd, school students, a person moving with a road, and they just decide to go attack him, or physically by their bodies, like put masks on their faces and take sticks and slingshots, guns, motorcycle, and chase this person or this school student and attack them. As well, sometimes they are from their home using drones to chase shepherds and sheep away from the fields. And the presence of the settlers in the area, they like the state make their presence legally by giving them what is called state land, which is a land that the state stole it from us and just give it for the settlers to create their farms, outposts, and settlements. And from there, the settlers' violence are invested by this government and this army that the settlers will chase and attack us mostly on the Palestinian special properties, which is legally they can't take this land. But by settlers' violence, if they keep violating the Palestinian shepherds and farmers from not using the private land, if this continue, for example, for 3 years, then the state can legally take this land and then give it to the settlers, and settlers keep expanding in this way. And what Avner, for example, was just explaining about 2021, we have witnessing it was the most year that we witnessed, and we had like settlers attacks. Mostly these settlers using the Jewish holidays, Saturdays and other Jewish holidays to gather and plan not just like a pogroms. For example, the example that happened in 28 of September 2021, when a group of settlers from the outpost of Abigail and Chavat Ma'on, over than 60 masked settlers ran down in the village. They were running from a home to another, smashing windows, properties, stepping goats, attacking people physically. I stand there next to the village. I filmed for 3 to 4 minutes, and that was the only video to prove that this pogrom took place in this community of Mufaggara by the settlers. Before, like 15 settlers were chasing me to take the camera from my hands and to beat me up, but hardly I make it and I escape from their faces with that video. But in these minutes that I spent there was settlers and it was the most scary moment in my life. because I see mothers and children are running down in the valley out of their homes. Some of them escaping inside the house and closed the doors, but they were not saved because settlers smashed the windows and keep throw stones inside the house to injure like 12 people, includes 3-year-old child who was sitting inside the house and were hit by a stone in his head. Water pipes, all the vehicles, over than 20 vehicles in the village were smashed. Tractors, like it was a really scene from the Nakba. That's what I saw in that moment. And what is more what is make it more hard and difficult when more forces come, like the soldiers were backing and coming with the settlers from since they moved from the outpost till the village, and soldiers were shooting tear gas and stun grenade and live fire bullets, and they shoot tear gas inside the houses where people are hiding. Always the soldiers job is to back those settlers and let them finish the mission that they're coming to do it. And what's more difficult for me personally, really, like when more forces and police come, these settlers having their slang shot and sticks and standing right next to the police and soldiers. None of them got asked for his ID or detained at that moment. After one day, they announced that because of the international pressure, international media, everyone talked about this. They announced that they arrest 5 of these settlers from the 60. I think all of them were minors. So maximum 2 of them leased in the jail for 3 days and they were released. And now no one in jail for this issue. Within all the evidence and the video, all what we collect to show also on the ground, the police come and took photos of the windows and everything that was smashed there. None of them is in jail for this issue. This is how the state really invests in the settlers' violence and make it really helpful for the army and the state by evacuating us. Because this kind of act, first is destroying our properties. Second, make us live in unfair situation because we are here in Area C under the Israeli military control. The Israeli army telling us in this situation, they are just having orders to protect the settlers, whatever they are doing. So we have no protection, and we have dozens, thousands of complaints in the police stations, in the Israeli police stations with all the documents. And according to YHD, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, over than 95% of Palestinian complaints against settlers' violence are closed without any investigation even. And those get to investigated are also closed after that. So also soldiers in the field are backing the settlers and make them do whatever they want. And when it gets to the police and to do complaints, they are not asked or arrested or detained. So always they feel free to do whatever they want and to continue their attacks and violence against us, which is not just a group of settlers doing it. It is a part of the policy, as the demolition of our homes, as the army training, the state making support for the settlers' violence.
Maybe a small follow-up question to you, Basil. Since you don't get any protection by the army or the police, would an international presence, let's say, of international activists or also of activists from Israel give you some sort of protection? And if yes, do you have this presence or not at all?
We have this presence. Those people like Israeli activists, when they come to the area, you can see also how it is racist, because soldiers arrest them and beat them up different times just for protesting or being with shepherds. Why I never saw this happening to us. Settlers come and put a mask on his face and shoot or have a stick or slang shot. As well to the internationals, they've been attacked by settlers and soldiers and arrested. It's kind of helping to have those activists in the area, to be with the shepherds and with the students, and to have just them as a protective presence in the area. But they also got attacked. They also got arrested by soldiers and attacked by settlers as well.
Thank you. Avner, in fact, according to international law, it would be the job of the army to protect the civilian population, right? Now, what Basil was saying is like they don't. It's rather that they go side by side and protect rather the settlers that are attacking the civilian population. Is like, how does that come? I mean, in a way, sometimes I think a soldier, a commander would also have to think on what he or she is doing from one side, and then the other side is the subject Basil was bringing up is the thing of accountability. Like if things happen, the perpetrators, in this case the settlers, they are not held onto account. Like what can an organization like Breaking the Silence or the human rights community in Israel do to change that, so that people are actually held to account? Not necessarily only a soldier or a settler like on the ground, but as well like to go steps forwards or to see what could be done to change that policy.
Yeah, I mean, I put in the chat our latest publication about settler violence, and I think a question that we receive often is, okay, so what's the dynamic? How do, the civilian entity, the settlers, have such a strong working relationship with an institutional body like the military? And I think part of what we have to understand is that definitely now, I mean, we're not going to go back to history, but definitely now, and this has been the case in the last couple of years, we really have sort of a hand-to-glove relationship between the military and the settler community. There are many different places where this is evident. I mean, Basil mentioned, and this is definitely the cases that are, sort of the end of the process of the attacks, in some cases dozens of masked settlers attacking homes or communities, and we've seen an increase in this, not only attacking shepherds in the field, but literally in the communities, and this is happening across. This is the end of a process that starts much before. And the process that starts much before is, for example, the relationship that the leaders of the settler movement have with high-ranking generals and politicians, right? The fact that leaders of the settler community are not only have institutional power as elected officials, but also have regional power as the heads of the regional communities of the settlers, right? That's not a power Palestinians have. There's no equality there, right? The entire system, and that's, by the way, the reason, or the official reason, the government has just collapsed, is that they didn't manage to pass the laws, or what is called the emergency Judah and Samaria emergency regulations, that basically are structured to make sure settlers are privileged over Palestinians. Settlers living in the occupied territories are carrying into the occupied territories the right of an Israeli citizen, right? Where Palestinians are under military rule. It's like I would go, if I'm it's like, imagine that I'm an 18-year-old, where in Israel you're allowed to drink when you're 18, and I'll go to, I don't know, the States where the drinking law is 21, go into a bar and say, give me a beer. And the barman will say, but you're too young. I said, no, but I'm bringing the law from back home, right? Doesn't work that way. In the occupied territories, it does. So what you basically have is a privileged community that can vote and be elected, that has political power, with another, the majority of the community, that the whole system is built to prevent them from having any kind of power, right? Palestinians are blamed with terrorism, not only when they'll protest, not only when they'll go to their farmland, but also when they'll try to go to the international community, right? Avigdor Lieberman called it international terrorism or diplomatic terrorism. But so you really have this situation, this reality, where in the highest level, the relationship is very clear, and that trickles down, right? So when I was sent to guard the settlements in the South Hebron Hills, right near where Basil grew up, in Susia and in Yatir, as a soldier, the person giving me an order was a settler, right? The regional guarding officers of settlements, getting their salary, getting their weapons, are settlers, ideological settlers who live in the settlements, are basically financed by the state. Now, they are there in the settlement for many years. They know much more about the region than most of the officers that are there for the first time. So the settlers are basically the ones giving orders in many cases to soldiers. We also have testimonies of these regional guarding officers leaving the area of the settlement. The moment they leave the area of the settlement, they have no authority, but they leave the area of the settlement. In some cases, this doesn't happen always, but just to understand the symbiotic relationship, we also have testimonies of these regional guarding settlers joining missions of soldiers. So when the symbiotic relationship is so close, you can also understand how they will tell soldiers or point soldiers, to look the other way when something, gray is happening, or how the soldiers see themselves as an extension of the settlers, right? Even though officially they have the ability to arrest the settler who is violent, it rarely happens, because they're basically, one, told, don't interfere, call the police. Two, not even the official orders, but the ethos, the spirit is, we're here to protect the settlers from the Palestinians. Who is to protect Palestinians from the settlers? Not us, not the soldiers, the policemen. And as anyone who's been in the occupied territories knows, there's many more soldiers than policemen. But this argument, I'll just give one other example, but a testimony that came to us, which is in this latest report, also sheds a bit of a light there. When we talk about Israeli soldiers today, obviously, some of the Israeli soldiers are settlers themselves, right? They are Israeli citizens. So we have a testimony of a guy who served in a unit, an elite unit, infantry unit. One of the people who served with him in his same unit, or in a parallel unit, was home for the weekend, right? He's a soldier during the week, goes back home in the weekend. He lives in a settlement, so he goes home to his settlement. And this soldier, who was a settler, was back home, was caught by a B'Tselem volunteer who filmed him. B'Tselem is a human rights organization. And Palestinian was filming while this soldier settler was home for the weekend with his military pants, his military gun, and he was caught burning a Palestinian field of wheat. Now, is he in that moment a soldier, or is he a settler? Right, he's a soldier at home, so he's a settler, but when he goes back to the army, who will he side with? Who does he see himself working with? And you basically understand case by case or moment by moment how the system is really built, or pushing in the same vector. It doesn't mean that settlers don't have contradictions or don't argue with soldiers. It doesn't mean settlers won't attack soldiers. That also happens. But the general vector is they're working together. And we saw this in an argument that actually took place, I think also due to the high level of violence, but also part of campaigning that some of us managed to do, basically forced a conversation in the Israeli cabinet where the Israeli chief of staff, Aviv Kochavi, was challenged by Omer Bar-Lev, the Minister of Interior Affairs, on this exact point. And he was basically, the Minister of Interior Affairs, was telling the Chief of Staff, why aren't your soldiers stopping violent settlers? And the Chief of Staff in a cabinet meeting said, that's not our job. Right? Now, this is not true. This is against army regulations, against the law. But if the Chief of Staff says this in a cabinet meeting, then you understand what this trickles down to in the end of the food chain. Now, sorry, last point, as Basil knows very well, the Israeli military, of course, has no problem arresting Palestinians, right? But also has no problem arresting Israeli Jews or Israeli activists, Israeli citizens that are activists, but that are supporting Palestinians. They're always arrested by the Israeli military. Just when it comes to Israeli settlers, suddenly there, the Israeli military says, oh, our hands are tied, wait for the police. So the absurdity is clear, but this is part of how this reality continues.
Thank you so much. And it's impressive. It's also scary how these things go hand in hand. And then again, if you imagine the people living in these villages and then kind of being exposed to this sheer power, having not much more than their houses and their bodies to resist. It's yes, it is impressive. Basil, we have like 5 minutes left. I wanted to hear from you, like just like if you want to wrap it up and just pass the message to us as well in the international community, but on an activist level. So we've heard what you and your community are doing, and then how Israeli Jews and the organizations are joining in terms of co-resistance. Is like, what can we do? Not that much in the sense of lobbying and advocacy, but as well like on the ground, as Anita, as Roman, like what would you expect from us?
I mean, everyone can do, like, I believe, something, even if it's small thing, it will be helpful. If not now, like when all of our efforts come together, it will help and do affect the situation and end this apartheid. First of all, thank you for organizing like Zoom meetings like this and educating people and affecting in people and telling them the truth as we are on the ground, like filming and writing, as Avner and his team bringing like tours and other stuff and breaking the silence in order to make efforts like by ending this situation. Where like even if you can do something big, but educating people and raise awareness around the situation of Masafer Yatta, of the occupied Palestine even, will be helpful, because people will get to know, more people will get like to hear about us, about our stories, and this will affect in the future, and hope like in the soon future will get to end this.
And I think I would like to give the thanks back to you and to Avner as well, because educating people is what you do. It's like it's your voices people listen to, and I hope that makes us in a way part of your struggle for human rights to be respected in Masafer Yatta. As Avner, you shared the latest report of Breaking the Silence. I'd invite everybody to read it, and as well like to follow Breaking the Silence maybe on Twitter, where you communicate and then also share pictures on what's happening and what's going on in Masafer Yatta, as well as following Basil on Twitter. I will put the links in the chat just now. I think it's good to be informed, and then yes, like let's try to make the voices heard that are talking for the rights of the communities in Masafer Yatta, and let's hope that this stops. Like first and foremost, now the military exercise that is taking place and really scaring people into their houses and not being able to leave, but then from there really to take it and to stop this unequal system that so many human rights organizations call apartheid. Thank you.
Also from my side, thank you very much, Avner and Basil, for being with us and for shedding light on this dramatic situation. Thank you also to the audience for being with us today. And this would be my last point. I would like to encourage everyone who followed this webinar to reach out, especially maybe if you have personal contact to journalists or to people in the administration, to reach out to them and to remind them that this occupation is still ongoing and it's even worsening, and people are still suffering and getting imprisoned without having done anything, and their houses getting destroyed. So we really have to remind people of what's going on so that the pressure on Israel will be increased. Thank you very much, and I hope you had an interesting webinar, and I wish you a very well afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.